As we saw in Lecture 14, Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas are in perfect agreement that our highest good, our ultimate aim, is happiness. We also saw in that lecture why it seems unreasonable to say that human happiness consists in things like wealth, honor, power, or physical pleasure. Finally, we also looked at Aristotle's and Aquinas' arguments as to why virtue, both moral and intellectual, must be such an important dimension of human happiness. So much so that Aristotle defined human happiness as, quote, a certain activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. But notice that to define happiness in that way is not simply to equate it with virtue, whether we're talking about moral virtue or intellectual virtue. Happiness is not virtue itself, but an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. What, we must ask then, is that activity? What precisely does human happiness consist in? Not surprisingly, Aristotle and St. Thomas conclude that if we're talking about specifically human happiness, it must be an activity of that part of us that is distinctively human, namely our reason. But both are also quick to point out that happiness cannot be the exercise of reason plain and simple. Remember that happiness is, by definition, our ultimate good, our highest aim, that beyond which there just is no further good to be attained. So it would not make sense to say that our greatest happiness, or our ultimate happiness, consists in exercising our reason over our passions, or even in the exercise of practical reason, that is, reasoning about what actions we will perform. Practical reason, even in discovering the truth, is not an end in itself. It's not a self-sufficient good, as we've seen happiness must be. The essence of what practical reason is to result in the right course of action. And so it points to a good beyond itself. And this is why Aristotle and St. Thomas finally conclude that perfect human happiness can only consist in pure intellectual contemplation. Intellectual contemplation, in other words, is both the highest activity in which the human person can engage, as well as the only activity that is properly described as something that's done for its own sake. Again, St. Thomas and Aristotle are speaking specifically about theoretical contemplation, not practical contemplation or practical reasoning. As important as practical reasoning is, its orientation is for the sake of action, something beyond itself. Theoretical contemplation, on the other hand, is its own end, its own good. When the intellect engages in contemplation, we are exercising that part of us that is highest, that which makes us most fully human. This claim reveals something very important about human virtue. All of the virtues, it turns out, in some sense fall short of our ultimate goal. One might even say that they are a means to that ultimate goal or that ultimate end. Now, to say that virtue only has value as a means to an end sounds wrong. Is virtue really only an instrumental good? Is not the good of temperance or moderation, for example, a good in and of itself? Perhaps it depends on what we mean. The virtue of temperance, by which our lower passions are properly ordered, is certainly not merely valuable as a means to some lower submoral end, such as the accumulation of wealth or the enjoyment of pleasure or the acquisition of power. But as Aristotle and St. Thomas both argue, it would also be wrong to say that this virtue, or any virtue, is an end in itself in some ultimate sense. The virtue of temperance is good because in the temperate person, reason exercises its rightful place above the passions. But why, a philosopher must press on, does reason have that rightful place? The answer is because reason is that by which our highest activity is exercised, and that activity is contemplation. To be self-indulgent, cowardly, unjust, stingy, or to have any other moral vice is to have a habit of character that stands in the way, stifles, or frustrates the attainment of our ultimate end, the highest activity in which the human person can participate. St. Thomas Aquinas elaborates on this even more fully. When he and Aristotle speak of intellectual contemplation, they mean something much more specific than just any old exercise of our speculative as opposed to our practical intellects. Much depends, of course, on what it is that the human person is contemplating. So there very well may be a great joy in contemplating birds or insects, or some other aspect of the created world. But it would be a very odd claim to say that the ultimate happiness of the human person, considered as such, is the contemplation of birds or insects. As you might recall from Lecture 22, the knowledge of this kind is named scientia by Thomas Aquinas and episteme by Aristotle. The scientific knowledge, on this example, of the entomologist or the ornithologist. But as St. Thomas argues, human happiness cannot consist in the consideration of such speculative sciences, for the reason that these sciences have as their object things like birds, insects, or rocks that are below us, and which owe their existence to something higher. In fact, the highest form of human contemplation, that in which our human happiness consists, would naturally have to be the contemplation of that which is highest. And this, of course, is God Himself. Not this or that creature, not this or that aspect of creation, but the Creator, the uncreated good. Only this provides the inexhaustible object of intellectual contemplation that is fitting or worthy of the intellectual creatures that we human beings fundamentally are. As St. Thomas Aquinas puts it, quote, "Final and perfect happiness can consist in nothing else than the vision of the divine essence." The first reason for this is, as he says, quote, "Man is not perfectly happy so long as something remains for him to desire or seek." And so if our contemplative gaze was limited to created things, even including very noble things, such as the essences of angels, there would still be more in the order of existence remaining to be discovered. But not only that, we would always have the awareness that we were lacking knowledge of the very highest thing, or the first cause of all things. We would know that, whatever it is that we were contemplating, there exists something better, nobler, more purely intelligible that lies still higher than what we're now seeing with our mind's eye. So ultimately, that awareness that we're still lacking something can only be removed by the discovery and the contemplation of the very first cause, God. And not only that, simply to know that God exists as a cause is only to know Him or to contemplate Him imperfectly. Recall the analogy used back in Lecture 8 involving the way in which humans can reason back to the existence of God after the manner in which someone reasons to the existence of a locomotive based on the motion of the train cars that they see. It's one thing to know that there must be something like a locomotive causing the train cars to move. It's quite another to actually see the locomotive for oneself. In the same sense, it's one thing to understand that there must be a first mover or a first cause based on the existence of creatures, but it's quite another to contemplate that first cause as he is in himself. Neither Aristotle nor St. Thomas believe that this direct intellectual vision of God's essence is possible for human beings in this life. So lofty is such an activity that Aristotle is even prompted to say that a life characterized by such contemplation, quote, would be more than human, and that a man who would live it would do so not insofar as he is human, but because there is a divine element in him. End of quote. Of course, for St. Thomas Aquinas, what this simply means is that perfect happiness, in spite of being what every human desire, choice, activity, and virtue is directed to as its end or goal, is something only attainable in the next life. Not only because that's when the dangers of poverty, illness, injury, and other material evils are finally removed, but because only in the next life are we spiritually in God's presence, contemplating Him, not through the mediation of creatures, but directly. And because God's essence is infinite, this contemplative act can never be exhausted. It is quite literally what we were made to do for all eternity. This activity in the Catholic tradition is, of course, called the beatific vision. And although Aristotle seemed to be aware that only something of this magnitude could fully satisfy the deepest longings of the human soul, he had no recourse to understand that such a thing could actually be reached, albeit with God's help. That is to say, with divine grace. Grace is not something that falls within a philosophical purview, since the very existence of grace is only known to us by divine revelation. And so this seems to be the point at which moral philosophy must give way to that science we call sacred theology. As we now leave the realm of the philosophical, it also seems to be the right place to conclude this lecture, this last lecture of a Thomistic introduction to philosophy. I hope that whatever insight you've gained in this course will inspire you to further contemplation of truth, the truth about the world, about morality, about what it means to be a human being, and about God. May God bless your pursuit of wisdom as He leads you closer to that truth.